Jones and Tammy Wynette, When Love Becomes a Battlefield. February 16, 1969. The Grand Ole Opry stage in Nashville was electric with anticipation. Two of country music's biggest stars were about to perform together for the first time as a married couple. George Jones, the greatest country singer who ever lived, and Tammy Wynette, the undisputed First Lady of country music, stepped into the spotlight as husband and wife. The crowd erupted. Nashville royalty had found each other. But behind the spotlights and applause, a different story was unfolding, one of addiction, jealousy and violence that would make their love songs sound like prophecies. Within months of that triumphant performance, neighbors would be calling police to their mansion. Within years, Tammy would be hiding bruises under stage makeup, and within a decade, their fairy tale marriage would explode into one of country music's most devastating public breakups. This is the story of how country music's golden couple became its most tragic cautionary tale. Two people who could sing about heartbreak better than anyone else, but couldn't stop breaking each other's hearts. A love affair that produced some of the greatest duets ever recorded and some of the ugliest headlines ever printed. Because sometimes the most beautiful songs come from the most broken places, and sometimes love isn't enough to save you from yourself. George Glenn Jones was born September 12, 1931, in Saratoga, Texas, into a family where music was both salvation and curse. His father was a hard-drinking man, whose rages were legendary, but who could also play guitar with heartbreaking beauty. His mother was a saint, who sang in the church choir and tried to protect her children from their father's worst impulses. Young George learned early that music could be both an escape from pain and a way to express it. By his teens, George was already showing signs of the genius that would make him a legend and the demons that would nearly destroy him. His voice was unlike anything anyone had ever heard, pure, emotional, technically perfect, and capable of conveying heartbreak in ways that made grown men cry. But he was also drinking heavily, fighting regularly, and showing the first signs of the mental health struggles that would plague him for decades. Tammy Wynette was born Virginia Wynette Pugh on May 5, 1942, near Tupelo, Mississippi, into poverty so crushing it made George's difficult childhood look comfortable. Her father died when she was young, leaving her mother to raise 5 children on a farm that barely produced enough to survive. Tammy learned early that beauty and talent could be tickets out of desperation, but they came with their own prices. She married young, had children young, and was divorced young, all while dreaming of a music career that seemed impossible from her circumstances. But Tammy had something that couldn't be taught, a voice that could make Stand By Your Man sound like both a love song and a war cry, and the kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. Both George and Tammy arrived in Nashville carrying the weight of failed marriages, financial struggles, and the kind of emotional baggage that makes for great country songs but difficult relationships. George had been married twice by the time he was 30, with a reputation for disappearing on drinking binges that could last for days or weeks. Tammy had survived an abusive first marriage and was working multiple jobs while trying to launch a recording career. When they met in 1966, George was already established as one of country music's premier voices, but his personal life was chaos. Tammy was just beginning to find success with songs like Apartment 9, but she was still struggling to support her 3 daughters as a single mother. They were both damaged, both talented, and both looking for something they'd never been able to find in their previous relationships. Their professional relationship began before their personal one, and perhaps that was the problem. George was producing some sessions for Tammy in 1967, and their voices blended with an almost supernatural perfection. The chemistry was obvious to everyone in the studio, not just musical chemistry, but something deeper and more dangerous. Tammy was married to songwriter Don Chappell when she and George began their affair. The relationship was supposed to be secret, but in Nashville's tight-knit music community, secrets don't stay hidden long. George would show up at recording sessions obviously infatuated with Tammy. Tammy would light up when George entered a room. Their duets became more intimate, more personal, as if they were singing love letters to each other. The affair was passionate and reckless from the start. George was still drinking heavily, which made him unpredictable and sometimes violent. But he was also capable of extraordinary tenderness, writing songs for Tammy and treating her like the star he knew she could become. For Tammy, who had spent her life with men who diminished her dreams, George's belief in her talent was intoxicating, but the relationship was built on deception from the beginning. Both were married to other people when they began their affair. Both were willing to lie to their spouses, their friends, and the press about what was happening between them. They established patterns of dishonesty and secrecy that would poison their relationship for years to come. When Tammy finally left Don Chapel for George in 1968, the Nashville music community was shocked by the brazenness of the affair. Country music had always been more forgiving of personal scandals than other genres, but George and Tammy had pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. Their love story was already becoming a cautionary tale before it had officially begun. They married in February 1969, just days after Tammy's divorce from Chapel was finalized. The wedding was small and private, but the implications were huge. Country music's two most emotionally powerful voices were now legally bound together, and everyone in Nashville was waiting to see whether their personal relationship could live up to the magic of their musical partnership. For a brief moment, it seemed like the fairy tale might actually work. George and Tammy's first years of marriage produced some of the greatest music in country history. Their duets, We're Gonna Hold On, Golden Ring, Near You, were masterpieces of emotional storytelling that perfectly captured the intensity of their relationship. Professionally, they were unstoppable. Tammy's solo career was exploding with hits like Stand By Your Man and Divorce. George was cementing his reputation as the greatest pure singer in country music, with classics like He Stopped Loving Her Today. Together, they were country music royalty, the couple everyone else aspired to be. They lived like royalty too, building a mansion in Lakeland, Florida, that was designed to be a symbol of their success and their love. The house was enormous, decorated with gold records and expensive furniture, surrounded by manicured gardens and equipped with every luxury money could buy. It was supposed to be their sanctuary, the place where they could be themselves away from the pressures of fame, but the pressures followed them home. George's drinking, which had been a problem throughout his adult life, got worse under the stress of maintaining his career and his marriage. He would disappear for days at a time, leaving Tammy to worry and cover for him with promoters and record labels. When he returned, he was often violent, either physically or emotionally, taking out his self-loathing on the person closest to him. Tammy's response was to try to control George's drinking and behavior, which only made the situation worse. She would hide his keys, pour out bottles of liquor, and try to manage his career in ways that prevented him from having opportunities to drink. George resented her attempts at control, seeing them as attacks on his independence rather than expressions of love and concern. The cycle became predictable and destructive. George would drink, disappear, or behave badly. Tammy would react with anger and attempts at control. George would feel attacked and drink more. Tammy would try harder to control him. Each iteration made their relationship more toxic and their individual problems worse. But somehow, through all the chaos, they continued to make extraordinary music together. Their personal pain became artistic gold, with songs that perfectly captured the complexity of love between two people who were slowly destroying each other. Their audiences could hear the authenticity in their voices, the real emotion behind the lyrics, because they were living every word they sang. What the public saw was the glamorous couple posing for magazine covers and performing love songs on television. What happened behind the closed doors of their mansion was much darker. George's drinking binges became legendary within Nashville circles, not for their duration or excess, but for their consequences. When George drank, he became a different person, paranoid, violent, and capable of cruelty that shocked even people who knew him well. He would accuse Tammy of affairs she wasn't having, destroy furniture and gold records in fits of rage, and sometimes physically attack her with a violence that left her needing medical attention. Tammy learned to read the signs of George's moods and tried to protect herself and her children, but it wasn't always possible. She started wearing more makeup to cover bruises, making excuses for George's behavior to friends and family, and developing the survival instincts that women in abusive relationships learn to depend on. The violence wasn't just physical. George was also capable of emotional cruelty that was perhaps even more damaging. He would attack Tammy's insecurities about her appearance, her intelligence, and her worth as a person. He would threaten to leave her, to destroy her career, to make sure she never worked in Nashville again. The man who could sing about love more beautifully than anyone else could also weaponized that same emotional intelligence to cause maximum psychological damage. But George wasn't a monster, which made the situation more complicated and more dangerous. Between the violent episodes, he could be extraordinarily loving, generous, and supportive. He would write songs for Tammy, surprise her with expensive gifts, and treat her like a queen. The contrast between his two personalities made it almost impossible for Tammy to leave, because she kept hoping that the good George would eventually overcome the bad one. Tammy's friends and family urged her to leave George, but she felt trapped by a combination of love, fear, and practical considerations. She had invested everything in their relationship and their career together. Leaving George would mean starting over professionally and personally at a time when she felt too damaged and exhausted to rebuild her life. The country music industry, which had celebrated their marriage as a fairy tale, was now complicit in covering up the reality of their relationship. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one wanted to be responsible for destroying country music's golden couple. Promoters, record executives, and even friends looked the other way when Tammy showed up with bruises, or when George missed shows because he was too drunk to perform. By the mid-1970s, the facade was becoming impossible to maintain. George's drinking had progressed from problematic to life-threatening, and his behavior had become so erratic that even his most loyal supporters were losing patience. He was missing shows, showing up drunk to recording sessions, and alienating the industry people who had supported his career for decades. The final straw came in 1975, when George's behavior became so erratic and dangerous that Tammy feared for her safety and the safety of her children. The details of what exactly happened have never been fully revealed, but those close to the couple said it involved George threatening Tammy with a weapon during one of his drunken rages. Tammy finally did what she should have done years earlier. She called the police. The incident wasn't reported in the press at the time, but it marked the beginning of the end of their marriage. Tammy realized that George's problems were beyond her ability to fix, and that staying with him might cost her her life. But leaving George wasn't as simple as packing her bags. Their careers were intertwined, their finances were complicated, and George's threats about destroying her professionally weren't empty. He had the connections and the influence to make her life in Nashville very difficult if she crossed him. The divorce proceedings, which began in 1975, were as ugly as their marriage had been beautiful in the public eye. Both sides hired aggressive lawyers and began airing every piece of dirty laundry they could find. George accused Tammy of being a gold digger who had never loved him for anything but his money and fame. Tammy accused George of physical and emotional abuse, alcoholism, and infidelity. The press covered every detail with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Hollywood scandals. Country music fans were forced to choose sides between two artists they had loved as a couple. The fairy tale had officially become a nightmare, and everyone was watching the disaster unfold in real time. The divorce was finalized in 1976, but the damage to both George and Tammy's careers and reputations was severe. Their professional relationship continued sporadically because their duets were still commercially successful, but their personal relationship remained toxic for years. George's response to the divorce was to drink more heavily and behave even more erratically. He entered what many consider the darkest period of his life, earning the nickname No-Show Jones for his habit of missing performances. His behavior became so unreliable that venues started requiring him to perform from a fenced area to prevent him from walking off stage mid-song. Tammy tried to rebuild her life and career, but she carried the emotional scars of her marriage to George for the rest of her life. She married several more times, each relationship seeming to be an attempt to find the stability and safety that her marriage to George had never provided. But she also struggled with her own demons, including an addiction to prescription painkillers that would eventually contribute to her early death. The country music industry didn't know how to handle the breakup of its royal couple. Radio stations continued playing their duets, but the songs now sounded like evidence of a crime rather than celebrations of love. Fans were confused and hurt, feeling like they had been lied to about the nature of George and Tammy's relationship. After her divorce from George, Tammy's personal life became fodder for Nashville gossip mills in ways that it never had during her marriage. Her relationships with politicians, other musicians, and various questionable characters were dissected and analyzed by a press that seemed hungry for more drama from the woman who had given them so much already. Some of the relationships were real, others were likely exaggerated or fabricated, but all of them were used to paint Tammy as someone whose personal life was perpetually chaotic. The woman who had sung Stand By Your Man was now portrayed as someone who couldn't maintain stable relationships with any man. The gossip was often cruel and sexist, focusing on Tammy's romantic life in ways that male country stars' relationships were never scrutinized. But it also reflected the reality that Tammy's judgment about relationships had been permanently damaged by her experiences with George. She seemed to be attracted to men who were either unavailable or unsuitable, as if she no longer knew what a healthy relationship looked like. George, meanwhile, continued his descent into alcoholism and erratic behavior. His missed performances and unprofessional conduct became legendary, but he was often treated with more sympathy than Tammy received for her personal struggles. The double standard was obvious and unfair, but it reflected the broader cultural attitudes about men's and women's behavior that existed in country music and society as a whole. Despite the personal chaos that defined their relationship, the music that George Jones and Tammy Wynette created together remains some of the finest ever recorded in any genre. Their duets captured something authentic about love and loss that transcended their personal problems and connected with audiences on a deep emotional level. Golden Ring tells the story of a wedding ring's journey through different relationships, but listening to it now, it sounds like a prophecy of George and Tammy's own relationship. We're Gonna Hold On was meant to be a declaration of their commitment to each other, but it now sounds like desperate wishful thinking. Near You is beautiful and heartbreaking, a perfect expression of the longing that defined their relationship, even when they were together. The tragedy of George and Tammy's story isn't just that two talented people destroyed each other through their personal demons, it's that they were capable of creating such beautiful art about love, while being so unable to sustain love in their actual lives. Their music was honest about the pain of relationships, but they seemed unable to learn from their own artistic insights. The George Jones and Tammy Wynette story cast a long shadow over country music's understanding of itself and its relationship with personal authenticity. Their success had been built partly on the idea that their real-life romance gave extra meaning to their love songs, but the revelation that their real-life relationship was abusive and dysfunctional called that entire concept into question. Country music has always marketed itself as more authentic than other genres, more connected to real life and real emotion, but the George and Tammy story revealed the dangers of that authenticity when it becomes a marketing tool rather than an artistic principle. Their pain was real, but it was also commodified and sold to audiences who weren't fully aware of what they were buying. The story also highlighted the country music industry's problems with alcohol abuse and domestic violence, issues that the genre has struggled to address honestly even decades later. George and Tammy's problems weren't unique in Nashville, but their fame made them impossible to ignore. George Jones died in 2013, still considered by many to be the greatest country singer who ever lived. His funeral was attended by virtually every major figure in country music, and his influence on the genre was universally acknowledged. But his legacy is complicated by the knowledge of how he treated the people closest to him, particularly Tammy. Tammy Wynette died in 1998, still carrying the physical and emotional scars of her relationship with George. Her final years were marked by health problems that many believe were related to the stress and trauma of her earlier life. She never seemed to find the peace and stability that she had spent her whole life seeking. Their daughter